Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're excited to have you here. We are going to start out with our morning keynote from April Panzer from SUNY System Administration. Thank you, April, for presenting for us today, and I'm going to let you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I looked at the registration to kind of see who I'd be speaking to this morning, and I was very pleased to note that there was a broad range of different backgrounds. There were academicians, there were project managers, there were a lot of tech people, and there was representation from the university centers, from the PhD granting universities, from the comprehensives, from the technical campuses, from the community colleges. I'd like to give a special shout out to the SUNY Online schools. I worked with the SUNY Online project prior to joining the academic services group. Now I work with Carrie Hatch and provide project management for the provost's office as part of the academic services team. My background is in project management for 30 years. Before that, I was a systems level programmer. I have had lots of interesting experiences as both a developer and a project manager. But I think I'll probably end my career at SUNY. I like working for SUNY very, very much. So special shout out to SUNY Online Schools, and to any of you that know me already through working with SUNY, hello, and I hope I get to visit with you one-on-one sometime during the day today. My presentation today is about project governance, and I'd like to get to know a little bit more about you and what kind of project management experience this group has had. So Chris has a little poll that she would like to share with everyone. And so Chris, if you could put up that poll, that'll give me an idea about everyone's breadth of experience with project management.
I'd like to answer the poll. It is to the right of your presentation screen. We have some stuff coming in. We'll give it a little go, see how things are going. Looks like we've got some different experience. I'll share the results here in a little bit. Doing well. I'll give it about 10 more seconds to see. All right, looking good. So I will share the results. Let's see what they look like. So there's the results you should see. April, we've got some people, a couple of you still voting, but we have 10% in project charters, about 13% for the RACI charts, 18% for software, 15% for project template documents, 18% for actually having project steering committees on campus, 22% or so for portfolio project management, about 5% for unsure.
Okay, great. So I see that the majority of you are not working with project management concepts, principles, tools. I'm in the below 20% mark on most of these things. So that's good. I won't be talking to like wasting your time by saying a lot of the things that I have to say. On the topic of project governance, you can Google, you can read a lot of theoretical information about this. You can read a lot of different opinions. There's a lot of material written out there by a lot of professionals. The things that I'm going to talk about today come from my own personal experience and the things that I've learned. It's not theoretical, and it's not from the textbooks. It's things that I've learned in 30 years from being a project manager. I'd like to start with things that I've encountered in my professional career, and coming into organizations that don't have project management set up, and it's not part of the organization, and the reasons that I've heard for not utilizing project management. And these are the top 7 excuses or reasons that I've heard for not implementing project management in an organization. And I'd like to run a quick poll and see if any of these reasons sound familiar to you, and if it kind of get a feel for what the top reasons might be. So this is another little poll that I'd like Chris to run for me, if you would, Chris.
And that poll all the way to the right. Got some votes coming in.
Do any of these sound familiar? I don't know, Chris. Is there any way that people can respond?
Yep. If you'd like, you can put something in the discussion forum on the right-hand side, or there also is the live Q&A available if you'd like to ask a question or respond directly to April. We can read that for her.
Okay, great. Thanks. I want to know if these resonate with anyone, if these are things that you've also heard in your career and your campus.
So it looks like we've got some different results here. About 4% say we've got too many managers already that they've heard. 33% have heard that we can't hire staff to do nothing but manage projects. About 26% we've gotten things done just fine without project management, and about 33% who has time to write all those documents. Let's get work done. Some different things out there.
So what was the top reason for not doing project management?
You're a tie between can't hire staff and writing all the documents. So 2/3 of the people said those 2 things.
Okay, so number 3 and number 6.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it seems like the excuse seems to be, or the common reason seems to be, that project management will consume more resources than it's worth. That project management will cost more money than it will generate. It's not worth the return on investment. So I want to keep that in mind as we move through this a little bit.
We do also have a couple responses in the Q&A. Jessica says that she's heard because we've always done it this way as a powerful motivator. And then Carrie indicates lack of training.
Unfamiliarity with the process. So that's a very good point. When people aren't familiar with a process, they believe that it might just not be any good. People are hesitant to go with things they're not familiar with. But the other answer, which was what was the first one?
We've always done it this way.
Yeah, the historical inertia. Yeah. So if you look at the reasons for project management, you can find the top 10 reasons for having project management. The things that jump out at me that are good reasons are to maximize resources, control cost, learn from failure, which goes back to controlling cost and maximizing resource because failure is expensive. Another 10 reasons: strategic alignment, risk management, continuous oversight, learn from success and failures. Then you might find 6 reasons, which are the 10 reasons, but without most of the good ones. I don't like lists of reasons for doing something that are any more than about 4 or 5. Because if they go beyond what you can count on the fingers of one hand, you probably have too many reasons to truly convince anyone. So my reasons for using project management are that they save the organization time and money. They improve communication within the organization. The organization can make better business decisions. And project management can help the organization repeat successes and limit failures. Now, I know this is true because I've been doing project management for 30 years in all sorts of different kinds of organizations, but someone who hasn't might ask the question, why? Why does project management produce these 4 results within an organization? And the reason is because projects are, by their very nature, because they're done by human beings, projects are transactional. In every project, you have someone that wants something done, a customer, and someone that's going to provide that thing, that's going to get that thing done for them, a vendor or an internal provider. And so every project is going to be made up at its core of a transaction. Someone who wants something done and someone who's going to do that for that party. Also, because projects are, by their nature, because they're done by people, projects are competitive. Projects are going to have competing agendas. Within them, there will be competing visions. And within them, there will be competing priorities. Because as you know, anytime you get two people together, you will have two different agendas. Two people together, two different visions. Two people together, two different sets of priorities. And project management helps align those competing agendas, visions, and priorities. And because the way projects are conducted is they are often matrixed. There's a matrix of different resources and a matrix of different schedules. And project management provides the authority to utilize those matrixed resources and to give priority to the schedules involved in the project over the schedules that are in place for the individual people given to them by their individual managers. So project management provides the authority to conduct the matrixed organizations for the purpose of the project and utilize those resources and command the schedules of those individuals for the purpose of accomplishing the project. Where's my next button? There we go. So what we want to look at today, now that we've kind of established some principles about project management, is the steering committee, which is right here in the stack. The normal stack for using project management in good project accomplishment is the sponsors on top. Below that is the steering committee. Then the project management office. There is sometimes a layer, an optional layer of operating committees or working groups. And in large organizations like SUNY, these are made up of the individual campuses that make their contributions or groups of campuses that are working together on special projects. Like when all of the medical universities get together to work on a specific buying program for the medical equipment that they need, or when campuses came together to purchase a product like Jaeger for procurement. So these special working committees or working teams are something that I've dealt with in very many circumstances, and you'll see those in the examples that I'm going to present later. But these are also very common in our SUNY environment. And then at the bottom are project teams with project leaders. So this is kind of the ideal that we're working toward. But in reality, what happens is that in immature organizations or organizations that don't use project management, we have a sponsor. These things aren't present. May or may not have working groups. And then the sponsor, when they have an idea about a project that they want to accomplish, they'll put together an ad hoc project team without any project managers. So the sponsor communicates directly with the project team and says, there's something that I want, here's your customer. And the sponsor puts together a project team to provide that need for him or her. So gets a group together and says, there's something I'd like you to build for me. And they build that. And so this is the way that it's happening in a lot of campuses. It's the way it's happening in a lot of organizations that don't use project management. Sponsor has an idea, has a need, puts together an ad hoc project team, and they take care of that need for that person.
Some comments in the Q&A. James says, that looks a lot more familiar, LOL.
Yes, it does. And it is in actuality even kind of familiar at system administration right now. So the next thing that happens when things get a little more complex and the organization matures a little is the sponsor may start using project managers. And as was mentioned earlier, people find themselves, if they've been asked to lead enough of these teams, is they find themselves as kind of ad hoc project managers. So the sponsor begins to go to the same people over and over again to lead projects, and they begin to find themselves acting as project managers for these project teams. But there's still no kind of formal bridges in place or supports in place for these people to act as project managers. They kind of find themselves in that role. And then what happens is the organization grows, and there get to be a second or third sponsors that also have project teams that are also led by project managers, either professionally trained or growing into the role. And then when these sponsors obtain enough power and funding, they sometimes develop visions. And so sponsor A will develop vision A, and sponsor B will develop vision B. And then they have budgets and they go off spending and building projects based on different visions for the organization. Now, I don't suppose any of you have ever encountered that, where one part of the organization is building projects based on their vision, and another part of the organization is building projects based on their vision, and these two visions might diverge. And so, in order to get a handle on that, they might begin to put in place a project management office. And one of the first things that they might put in place is project portfolio management. And project portfolio management is put in place to help the executive team decide which projects to build, to get a handle on a process where different parts of the organization are building things out without consulting other parts of the organization. Kind of the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so they'll place this project portfolio management to kind of bridge the gap so they can see what each other is building and they can get some control over spending. So it goes through a process of presenting a business case that all the sponsor, all the C-suite can review and say, yeah, we're going to spend money on this business case, but not this business case. And now we can all see what we're spending money on. And this is very often the first step in project management that gets introduced to organizations, is the step of deciding how to spend money based on business cases and greater visibility. But what happens when those business cases get presented to those different sponsors is they get torn in pieces based on the different visions, because they don't share a strategic vision. So when a business case gets put in place, they say, okay, well, yeah, we like that business case, but A wants to implement it in this way based on their vision, and B wants to implement it in this way based on their vision. And then when they give it to their project teams are left to fight it out as to how it's going to be implemented based on their sponsor's strategic vision. And this pretty much paralyzes the organization. So what we need here, what we have missing here is, even when we have multiple sponsors and we have introduced a PMO that may handle project portfolio management, PPM, and may even begin to start handling implementation lifecycle project management. If there is a piece missing here, the piece that we're talking about today, project governance, things can still get out of hand, because different project teams can come in and begin to implement projects in different directions based on the strategic visions of their specific sponsors that may be divergent. For Vision A and Vision B that lead those project teams in different directions. So what we have to do is fill in this spot, and that's what we're talking about today. Filling in this spot of governance, the steering committee spot. Now, people call them governance boards, steering boards, governance committees, steering committees. My phrase that I use is steering committee, but you can plug in any of those other phrases. It is this spot right here in the stack between the sponsor and the PMO, the operating groups, and the project teams. So what happens is the steering committee comes in and gets their arms around the sponsors and their divergent visions and helps them create a combined strategic vision that encompasses sponsor A's vision, sponsor B's vision, sponsor C's vision, and puts together a vision for the organization that includes everybody. So that when these teams come into play from the different sponsors, they can all be one organized team, all reporting to the same vision that is articulated by and adjudicated by the same steering committee. Now, there are basically two kinds of steering committees, or steering committees that have two kind of overarching kinds of mandates. A steering committee can have a strategic focus, or a steering committee can have an operational focus. So if you look at the sponsor level, sponsors are basically talking about what they want done for the organization. They have the strategic vision. If you look at the PMO is primarily talking about how to get projects accomplished. Not what projects get accomplished, but how to implement projects in the best, cleanest, most effective way. So sometimes there's a line that runs through steering committee functionality. Sometimes steering committees are more interested in responding to the sponsor and responding to what gets built. Or sometimes steering committees are more interested in responding to the PMO and executing how things get built, controlling and governing how things get built. So strategic types of governing boards help to provide a vision for the organization, help to consolidate and align that vision, monitor projects using PMO tools, guidance, and standards. Operational governing boards are interested in providing guidance on how to execute projects and monitoring how well those standards, techniques, guidance, and tools work, and evaluating their results and tuning and perfecting the how of project execution. And both of these things are equally valid and equally necessary in an organization. You might choose which kind of steering committee you need at any point in time based on the organizational maturity of the project management office within the organization. So if your organization does not have a mature PMO, then you might look at having an operationally focused steering committee. If it does, then you don't need one, because who would set up a steering committee to manage something that's already in existence, mature, and working well? You might look at the type of project that needs some governance. If the project is small and uncomplicated and not strategically very important, so for instance, if it's a project just to replace an LMS that has reached end of life, you have some vendors, most of the vendors are known to you, you have a long time to manage the cutover, to migrate the data, you might not need a governing board for that at all. If all the factors are known and all the players are familiar and you have a long time to do the project, maybe you don't need a governing board for that, because the vision is aligned, the players know what to do, and you've got plenty of time to do the project. So, but if your project is large in scale, very complex, of great strategic importance, maybe you have a tight budget or a tight timeline, then definitely you might need a strategic type of governing board. You might need to look at the differences in the at the sponsor level, the differences of vision, agenda, approach, or budgets at the sponsor level to see if you need a strategic type of governing board to pull together differences or competition actually at the sponsor level, so that those differences don't get pushed down to the project level where fighting or tug of war will keep anything from actually getting accomplished. And if your fiscal profile in your organization is such that your money's very tight, then you might want to look at having both types of governing boards, because remember, as we know, a project management office can help you save time and money and be more successful, which a successful project is one that saves money because failures are expensive. Then you might want to have both types of governing boards that both perfect the activities of your project management office and help align sponsor visions so that you don't waste money running your wheels or getting stuck high center on visions that are competing at your sponsor level. Okay, so these are 10 items, 10 mandates for governing boards that we're going to see later on this afternoon. So I'd like you to look at these and let's just ponder them for a moment and see if you can pick out which mandates are operational and which mandates are strategic. I don't think we can poll these because they're not yes or no answers, but we'll just look through these for a minute and see if you can pick out which numbers you think might be operational versus strategic. If you have any questions about these that you can't really decide in your mind which are which, let me know. Maybe we can discuss these. Would anyone like to pick out any of these that they feel confused about whether they might be strategic or operational, and that you'd like to discuss and take a look at them more closely? Or does it seem pretty clear cut which is which kind of steering committee?
If you want more clarification, please feel free to put it in the live Q&A. We'll definitely read it out loud to April.
Hi, April, it's Krista. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I'm looking at number 9, improving the ability of the institution to respond to strategic changes. We've seen a lot of that this year with COVID. It's a large pivot for all of us. I'm thinking that would definitely be a strategic committee. However, it happened so quickly and we had to operationalize so quickly. That's almost a hybrid, isn't it?
You know, our organization didn't have time to use much project planning at all to respond to COVID. People wanted to act very quickly, and they didn't want to do any planning at all. They just wanted to strike out and act. And it was hard to get people to stop and plan. And the steering committee that they set up to respond to COVID was a very action-based committee. And so that steering committee tended to be both. They tended to do their own planning and project work at every meeting, and also attend to their strategic plans. So it almost turned into a project working group instead of a steering committee at the same time. So it was quite a hybrid, actually, but it didn't define or establish any new project management tools or standards. So I think it was pretty much strategic, yeah. Okay, just something to think about. If there's no confusion about this, we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so we've looked at the stack kind of vertically, but let's see how this lines up in terms of through time setting up a project. So the project sponsor has an idea and uses that idea to match the strategic direction for the organization and sets it before a steering committee. The steering committee will either be set up to provide strategic guidance for that idea in building a project, or provide operational guidance for the organization. The project management office, with all their various tools and standards, provides operational guidance, standards, and tools for projects. The steering committee, on one hand, will give guidance or advice about what those standards and tools should be. And in response, the project management office provides all the metrics and information about how those tools were used for the steering committee to evaluate them, do postmortem on them, and see how well they've been used and make changes or adjustments. So in this case, the steering committee is driving information toward the project management office by specifying what the tools and standards should be, and then getting information back from the project management office in order to evaluate how effective they have been. On the other hand, the project management office uses those tools, uses the Gantt chart, the payment schedule, the design documents, the various templates, to give information about a project to the steering committee, so the steering committee can evaluate how well the project is going, and then respond back to the PMO with guidance and escalation and monitoring about the project. So there's two kinds of different information flows depending on whether you have an operational steering committee or a strategic steering committee. Then you have your intrepid project manager come in and color these tools to reflect takes the generic template tools and makes them specific to their project, sets up the goal line for their project, and then begins assembling the project team to get the project accomplished. And then go. The project is underway. And then the project manager reports back to the PMO, that reports back to the steering committee. And depending on what kind of steering committee they are, they may be evaluating how well these tools worked, or they may be evaluating how well this project team worked to get the project accomplished. Now let's look at this in a slightly different way. As we looked at that stack before, we were looking at the triangular stack, and we were just looking at what their activities were. But there's another way to look at this, and that has to do with the amount of decision-making responsibility in any project. So let's say if there's 100% decision-making responsibility, in any project, then in immature project organizations where there's just an executive and the project team, that there's two ways that decision-making process can be divided up. The project team, the executive sponsor, can have the idea and set up the project team, and then the project team can depend pretty heavily on the executive to answer questions about the product that the executive wants built. So the decision-making can be divided about 65-35. And in this scenario, there's no PMO and there's no steering committee. It's just direct communication between these two. In this case, the project team depends very heavily on the executive sponsor to clarify requirements so they can provide the executive sponsor with precisely the product or good or service that the executive sponsor needs or wants built. This takes up a lot of time of the executive sponsor, but it provides an opportunity for this person to more likely get the thing that they want. It can also be divided up this way, where the executive sponsor puts the idea out there and the team runs with it and makes 95% of the decisions. This is another way of doing it. The executive sponsor doesn't have to spend much time or effort involved in the team. The team takes all the decisions, but the chances of the executive sponsor getting what they wanted are pretty low. Low investment, low probability of success. Now, if a PMO is added back into this process and they take 10% of the decision making by putting in place tools and standards, this can alleviate some of the responsibility off the executive sponsor and some of the responsibility off the project team. But there's still some additional requirements and adjudicating that the executive sponsor will have to do. If there are conflicts about agenda or priorities that the PMO doesn't handle, the PMO is a neutral body. They're not adjudicating those kinds of issues. They're not handling the fact that this team wants to do it this way, and this team wants to do it that way. There are design decisions or competition for resources. These things will go back up to the executive sponsor to handle, or not. And the team just works it out. Again, you have a trade-off. Either the executive sponsor spends more time getting into development issues and perhaps gets a better product, or doesn't spend the extra time getting into development issues and perhaps doesn't get a better product. But there's no one to help adjudicate those issues. And the PMO is there to help with the smooth running of the project. Now, if you add in a steering committee, but don't have the PMO, then you've taken some burden off of the executive, but the project team isn't there. The project team now has to bridge the gap between itself and the steering committee. So if the steering committee needs information about the project team that are doing the development now has to also do the communication work, the documentation work to send information to the steering committee. So that time has to be added somewhere. The steering committee can take the time to talk to the project team and do the documentation themselves before it goes to the executive. Or they can ask the project team to write their own documentation, their own design documents, their own functional specs, their own release plans, their own test plans, and before it goes to the steering committee. The ideal situation is where you have a bridge between the project team and the steering committee, which is the PMO, that puts the work of the project team into the standard formats and ensures that the project team's communications and designs fit in the standard format that goes to the steering committee in a condensed way that they can understand, so that all of the project design and development details are condensed into an easily digestible format. And then the steering committee provides a bridge between the project team and the executive by handling, resolving details that they can resolve, aligning visions that they can align, handling issues and risks that they can handle, so that they handle as many things as they can so that everything doesn't have to go to the executive. So these layers between the project team and the executive sponsor of the steering committee and the PMO provide bridges between the project team and the executive sponsor, so that each of these entities can do the thing that they're best suited to do. And these layers can make the project run smoother and provide help for the project in precisely the ways that it needs the help.
April, I have a question. You may be getting to this shortly or in your next presentation. Is it common to have each one of these bubbles unique individuals? Or is it sometimes where someone exists in multiple bubbles?
There's overlap of individuals. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we'll start talking more about personnel, but yeah, there's definitely overlap of people in these bubbles. So when I talk about the things that they're doing, they're different roles. They may be performed by some of the same people.
Okay, thank you.
So these bubbles of roles and people don't exist in a vacuum. The executive sponsor is informed by, beholden to, organized, interfaced, coordinated with the board of directors and other executive leadership teams. The steering committee, if the executive leadership is not on the committee, which to your point, they may very well be. If not, then they are certainly informed by and coordinated with the executive leadership team. The steering committee, if sponsors do not sit on the steering committee, they are certainly informed by and consulted by the steering committee, the sponsors. The working groups that are often in a layer right here between the project team and the PMO definitely are consulted by the steering committee, and often members of working groups often attend steering committee meetings or might be permanent members of steering committees. Subject matter experts very often attend steering committee meetings on an ad hoc basis in order to report on various things or provide their expertise or guidance on various issues. Subject matter experts are also part of PMO from time to time. Working groups are also brought in to consult with the PMO from time to time. Subject matter experts are definitely part of the project team. Working groups are definitely brought in as part of the project team. So now that we understand the percentages of decision-making responsibility for these various groups and who they consult with, what types of decisions are they making? So for this 5%, what are the decisions that make up this 5% number? Sponsors make decisions about projects that fulfill the organization's strategic vision. That's pretty simple. And the project team here on the outside make decisions about tactical actions to implement the design that fulfills the business customer's needs, or in other words, the project implementation lifecycle is what's going on out here. So the need, the customer, and the fulfillment of the need, the provider. So this might be the vendor, it might be the internal provider. So let's talk about what goes on here in these bridging groups. In the project management office, decisions are made about operational standards, tools, and guidance for managing projects. They fall into these categories: project methodology, what development methodology, what operational impact analysis, and what delivery methodology. And then you have the big four in every single project: scope, schedule, cost, and quality. And finally, risk management and issue management. So the risk log and mitigation plans, and the issue log and resolution plans. So this is what the PMO, any PMO, anywhere, these are the general high-level categories of things that the PMO is interested in setting standards for and providing tools for and providing guidance on. So if this is what the PMO is interested in, and this is what the project is interested in, and this is what the sponsor is interested in, then the steering committee will surely touch on all of these things in some form or another in their 20% of decision-making projects. And as we discussed, a steering committee can have two major different kinds of focus. So the strategic guidance for a project, the strategic type focus of a steering committee will have basically two major sets of decisions to look at. They will first establish project governance. And in order to do that, they will form the steering committee itself. So they'll make decisions about steering committee formation. They'll set out the roles and responsibilities, sometimes in a RACI chart. This is a kind of handy shorthand way of setting out roles and responsibilities in a RACI chart. It's a chart that says for any step in the process, who is responsible, who is accountable, who gets consulted, and who gets informed. So responsible is who has the delivery. Accountable, who signs off, who has the authority. Consulted, who gets consulted, who gets brought in to contribute, who are the contributors. And informed, who gets kept in the loop of the status, who knows what's going on. Another thing is escalation. So what things get brought to the steering committee for resolution, and oversight. Their oversight responsibilities is to monitor the key program aspects. And we discussed the key program aspects over here in gray. Scope, cost, budget, change orders, payments, anything having to do with money, schedule, quality, all the testing issues, and risks and issues. So somebody will be reporting out on each one of these things, and so that the project, the strategic guidance of the project knows where the project is at with respect to all of these aspects of the project. And if the steering committee has a more operational guidance role for the organization, then they might, first of all, establish PMO governance by doing these very same set of things here, establishing the steering committee roles and responsibilities, escalation, oversight, and then also review the use of standards and tools for each project, conduct project postmortems and publish lessons learned, establish working groups and conduct partnering workshops between the various project teams to help their work go more smoothly, and escalate review of the project portfolio management process and the implementation lifecycle PMO processes to assure adherence to standards. So these are some of the decisions that are made by steering committees based on their two different types of roles in the organization. Finally, this is our last slide before I open it up to some discussion or questions. When setting up a steering committee and figuring out all of the hows, which is what we're going to do this afternoon, these are some of the questions, kind of 4 sets of questions that one should ask themselves before they get started. And the first and most salient question is, does this project need a steering committee? Not all projects need a steering committee. I think maybe you've gotten a sense now about which projects wouldn't and would not need a steering committee. And does the steering committee need to meet regularly or merely be set in reserve as an ad hoc resource? And that's certainly a possibility. You can have a steering committee that you set up and you only call on them based on certain triggers. If you have escalations, issues, certain things that need to be handled, then you assemble the steering committee to handle them. Otherwise, they're just set in reserve for you. Or they might meet regularly. Next, if you ask yourself what the standing agenda items should be, and the last slide gave you some hints, and who should present each item on a standing agenda, then answering those questions will help you figure out who should lead the committee and who should be on the steering committee. Because who needs to present the standing agenda items, what they are, who needs to present them, and who needs to hear them and respond to them will make up the people that need to be on the steering committee and give you a hint about who should lead a steering committee. And just think about this for a moment. The person that leads the steering committee should not necessarily be the most highly placed person on the steering committee. Sometimes it's useful to put just a plain old ordinary project manager to lead the steering committee, because sometimes it's important to have someone who's just watching the clock, does not have any vested interests, and is not anybody's boss to say, okay, we have to move on to the next item so that we can get everything completed on the agenda. And we'll say, I'm going to have to cut you off now because we have to move on. Or someone that won't push their own opinion onto the rest of the committee, so that two people that need to argue it out, one of them isn't leading the committee. So they're both kind of on even ground. So that might be an interesting thing to consider when you're specifying who will lead the committee. Then the final question, what's the cadence of the steering committee and the duration of the committee? Don't overuse your steering committee by having them meet too often or for too long. Okay, so that's me. Does anyone have any comments or questions that they would like to pose to me in the last 9 minutes of the presentation? I'm sorry I talked so long.
Free to post your questions in the Q&A section, and Krista and I will be happy to read them out to April so that she can answer them for you. As well, if we don't get to all of the questions, we will download them and we can answer them offline and send them in our follow-up email. I have one from Janine Moyer. Janine asks, is it a steering committee per project or an organization-wide steering committee that oversees all projects?
That's a good question. It can be. Now, so for instance, if the committee's reason for existence is to do project portfolio management, which is a special branch of PMO activity, which selects which projects are going to be mobilized and put into the budget and which are not, that would be a standing steering committee that stays in place all the time, and their function is just to examine business cases and decide which ones move forward, and to work through the ROI on those business cases, move them from gate to gate, and figure out which ones get done and which ones don't. So that would be a standing steering committee. But normally, projects get a special steering committee for each project, because, as you'll see this later when I go through the project by project steering committee, projects get formed by the organizations that are participating in the project. And rarely, I guess you could have projects that had all the same people or participants, but that would be rare. Normally you form a steering committee with the specialized people that have something to contribute for that project, and then they get disbanded and reformed for another project. So normally steering committees are specific to certain projects if they're strategic steering committees. Now, an operational steering committee that is just looking at the PMO and how to improve the PMO, how to set it up and improve it, that would be a standing steering committee that stayed in place over time. So there are some steering committees that have a more operational nature that would stay in place over time, and some that just stay in place for the duration of the project, and they would be project specific.
James asked, do you have any suggestion? I'm sorry, I apologize. Chloe asked, do you have any suggestions for how many folks to include in the steering committee? Is there a best practice, or does it depend on the project?
It depends on the project, either operational or strategic. You want enough people so that you have adequate representation to handle all the projects that might come up, but you don't want too many people so that the work gets diluted, the opinions get diluted. So you want just enough to handle the mandate of the committee, but not so many that it gets diffuse and argumentative, like too many cooks spoil the broth. So just enough to handle the mandate. And the right people, they have to be the decision makers or their delegates.
Would you
James
say,
asks,
April,
how
that,
define,
oh,
sorry.
Sorry, Chris. Would you say, April, on that point, that the larger the project, the larger the steering committee? Is that
The more
in your
diverse,
experience?
the more diverse the project, the larger the steering committee. Not necessarily larger, but the more diverse.
James asks, how defined does a project need to be to benefit from a steering committee? I feel like sometimes projects start as a problem statement and have difficulty moving into a solution or a chosen solution direction.
Ah. Yeah, you know, if your project is too vague, then it shouldn't move forward until it coalesces. And if the one mandate of your steering committee is to coalesce that problem statement into something that, you know, you can draw a box around the scope, then that's a good use of your steering committee. But, you know, even a steering committee can't solve a project that tries to go forward without a well-defined scope. And I've got a great example of that in the next presentation. That's destined for failure. So
right, the problem statement has to be clear.
Yeah, that's a great use of steering committee, though, is to you know, draw a bright line around the scope of a project in order to get it moving.
Excellent point. I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions in the last 3 minutes of April's first presentation today? Feel free to pop it into the Q&A, and we'll definitely let her answer. Oh, we've got one from Artur. Similar to the previous question, often sponsors just pick a product and the problem statement is to implement that product. What would the steering committee do in this case?
Maybe that's an example of not needing a steering committee. Honestly, I mean, when you ask yourself, does this project need a steering committee? Maybe in that case, the answer is no. This project doesn't need a steering committee.
These are all great answers, April. Thank you.
I mean, you don't want to overburden a project by having a lot of things in it that you don't need. And if you know the product, and it depends on, you know, if it's a difficult vendor and if it's a big product with lots of moving pieces and a short time frame, you know, if it's got a lot of complexity and strategic value and your vendor is difficult, then yeah, you need a steering committee. But if it's a vendor you've worked with before and it's not complex and there aren't a lot of moving pieces and you understand the product, then you might not need a steering committee. It depends on other factors than just it's a product implementation. It depends on what kind of problems are you going to face implementing that product with that vendor. And if you're not going to face many problems and it's not going to be complicated and it's not going to be strategic and it's not going to be time critical, then you don't need a steering committee. But if you anticipate facing a lot of problems with either the vendor or where you're going to implement it at, or your time or your money, then you need a steering committee to help you solve those problems. That's pretty much it. Without more information, you can't know if you're going to need a steering committee or not.
Wonderful.
And about, you know, if your boss comes to you and says, you know, just implement this product, and you know it's going to be a lot of problems and you're going to need a steering committee, you can go back to your boss and say, you know, here's the list of issues that we're going to face. Here's the list of risks. We're going to have to resolve all these issues and mitigate all these risks. And either you'll let me set up a steering committee to handle these, or I'm going to be coming to you for every single one of these, or I'm going to be trying to handle these myself. And, I might not be able to. And we might, these risks might happen and these issues might happen unresolved. So, you decide. Do you want to take your time every day or every other day or every week to handle these problems with me? Or do you want to help me set up a steering committee? Because the decisions have to be taken by somebody. They either all get taken by me at my level, or I put them all on your desk, or we work together to set up a steering committee. The work's there. You just have to decide who's going to do it.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for it. We are going to take a quick morning break right now and then come back for April's second presentation. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. It means a lot to us. So feel free to go back to the timeline, grab yourself another cup of coffee, water, tea, whatever your pleasure is, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.